Destitute Black Boy Yelled, stop. It's poison. Billionaire froze when he learned the truth. Rain lashed the glass walls of crescent moon, thunder rolling like a warning too late to hear. Inside, where billionaires dined under gold chandeliers, Nathan Caldwell raised a crystal goblet, unaware it glittered with death. Then the door slammed open. An 18-year-old boy soaked, hood-torn sneakers dripping, charged forward with a cry that sliced the music in half. Stop! It's poison! The room erupted. Guests gasped, chairs scraped, security surged. But it wasn't madness in Marcus Evans's eyes. It was a calculation, precision. His gaze locked on the wine, reading chemical truths others couldn't see. In that instant, his voice carried the weight of science and something personal. The goblet slipped, glass shattered, amber liquid bled across white marble, its scent barely traceable. Bitter almond, cyanide, deadly. Caldwell froze, heart thundering louder than the storm. How could this destitute kid know? Why did his words strike deeper than fear, almost like memory? Marcus clutched a weathered notebook against his chest, pages scarred with formulas and secrets. He wasn't just saving a stranger, he was exposing something bigger, something Caldwell had spent years trying to bury. And in the silence after the crash, as lightning carved the city skyline, one truth became undeniable. This boy and this billionaire were bound by a past neither had spoken of, until tonight. What Marcus revealed next would ignite a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy empires, and rewrite both their lives forever. Beneath the roar of traffic and the ceaseless running of rain, a boy hunched under the skeletal frame of a highway overpass. The November storm had turned the city into a wash of glistening asphalt and rushing gutters, but Marcus Evans barely noticed. He had grown used to storms, outside and within. Around him, fragments of discarded lives littered the ground. Broken glass bottles, a half-crushed soda can, a cardboard mattress sagging from dampness. Yet in this unwelcoming corner of the metropolis, Marcus had carved out something extraordinary. Beneath the echo of engines, between graffiti-stained pillars, he kept a fragile dream alive. A milk crate served as his workbench, covered with scavenged treasures that others dismissed as trash. A chipped beaker was rescued from a university dumpster. A bent metal rack is missing two prongs. Test strips he traded for tutoring a community college student who couldn't balance equations. Strips of LED lights powered by a salvaged battery gave his world a faint blue glow when the night pressed too hard. To an outsider it looked like chaos. To Marcus it was an order. Every item had a purpose, every fragment a possibility. His lab was his sanctuary. It was also his weapon against the despair clawing at him since the night flames devoured everything he once believed stable. Homelessness was not a label he accepted willingly. It had been forced on him after a blast at the laboratory where his parents worked. Dr. James Evans, a meticulous chemist, and Dr. Laura Evans, a geneticist, with laughter that filled any room. The explosion was ruled an accident, the kind filed away in official records as a tragic mishap, another line in safety statistics. But Marcus never believed. He had memorized the expression on his father's face the morning before the blast. Tense, distant, as though carrying knowledge too dangerous to share aloud. He remembered his mother's whispered warning about locked drawers and research notes that must never disappear. Those fragments haunted him like echoes in smoke. Now, months later, the boy who once dreamed of MIT carried their memory inside a worn photograph. The edges had curled from weather, rain had blurred his mother's smile, but their eyes remained sharp, reminders of love, of ambition, of everything stripped from him. Each time despair tempted him, Marcus would hold the photo close, feeling the weight of their absence and the demand to keep pushing forward. Knowledge is power. His father's mantra replayed like a drumbeat. If knowledge were power, then Marcus would not let poverty silence. Under the overpass, the city never slept. Sirens cut through the night like jagged edges. Tires hissed as they crossed puddles. Occasionally footsteps echoed as other forgotten souls sought refuge from the downpour. Some nodded to Marcus, recognizing the boy who tested their water for contamination, who explained with patient certainty why cloudy liquid from a cracked pipe should never be swallowed. He charged nothing. Payment wasn't the point. Protecting them. In a world where no one else cared, he offered his mind. He carried strips of pH paper, explained colors, and warned when something invisible threatened. He was not their savior, he was their brother. And in return they gave him space, respect and sometimes a warm meal salvaged from nearby kitchens. Marcus never pitied himself. Hunger gnawed at him, yes. Cold bruised his skin, yes. But weakness, that he refused to accept. He spent evenings scavenging near research campuses, diving through dumpsters where experiments left behind treasures others could not recognize. Broken pipettes became teaching tools. Chemical containers, even empty, told stories he deciphered. Each discovery added to his arsenal. He was building not only a lab but a fortress of intellect, and deep inside, beneath layers of grief and loss, a question festered. Was the explosion that killed his parents truly an accident, or was it murder disguised as fate? The rain intensified, hammering the steel beams above. Marcus adjusted his hoodie, water dripping down his cheekbones. He leaned over a cloudy sample of water collected from a leaking hydrant. The liquid shimmered faintly under his LED light. A few drops of reagent from a small vial spread like ink, then shifted color, orange tinged with sickly green. He scribbled results into his battered notebook, its cover patched with duct tape, pages filled with cramped handwriting and diagrams. To him, each line was a shield, each calculation a reminder that even in the gutters of society, knowledge could illuminate truth. He knew most people saw only a teenager on the margins, but in his mind, he carried a laboratory, a courtroom, even a revolution. Sometimes, late at night when the storm softened into drizzle, he allowed himself to imagine what might have been. MIT had once been within letters of recommendation written scholarships, whispered as possibilities. He had solved problems that teachers could not, uncovered errors in textbooks, that left professors stunned. He was not just gifted, he was relentless. Yet the blast stripped all of that away. Without guardians, without stability, he became another name on a social workers list, another youth, shuffled into shelters he could not endure. Rules suffocated him, fear lurked there too, so he chose the streets, and the streets chose him back. Still, the ember of ambition refused to die. He imagined his father's voice teaching him about atomic bonds, his mother's hands guiding his as he first learned to hold a pipette. They had treated science not as sterile formulas, but as poetry waiting to be translated. That spirit lived on in Mark. Under every overpass, beneath every storm, he nurtured it. Others carried weapons to survive. Marcus carried equations. On nights when despair threatened to win, he closed his eyes and replayed his father's words. Knowledge is power, not wealth, not privilege, not connection. Power was in the ability to see what others overlooked, to uncover danger before it claimed lives. He clung to that mantra, even as hunger hollowed him, even as strangers stared with suspicion. That belief steadied him, even when the city felt like it might devour him whole. One evening, as thunder rolled like drums of war, Marcus discovered something unsettling. A water sample drawn from a cracked city pipe near the restaurant district carried a faint, almost imperceptible odor, sweet, like almonds. He froze, instincts sharpening. Cyan, not enough to kill in that sample, perhaps residue washed down by rain, but the scent lodged in his brain like a warning. Someone was careless, or someone was reckless. Either way, it reminded him how fragile life could be when corporations hid behind polished doors while streets drowned in poison. He recorded every detail, tracing possibilities, knowing patterns mattered. He did not yet realize how soon that knowledge would thrust him into a storm far more dangerous than the weather. The city glowed beyond the overpass, skyscrapers lit like sentinels above shadow. Marcus watched them, eyes narrowed. Those towers represented power hoarded, secrets locked away, decisions that cost lives in alleys like his. But they also represented possibility. One day, he vowed, his mind would carry him past their gates, not as a beggar, but as an equal, perhaps even as a reckoning. He was not powerless, he was preparing. Beneath relentless rain, Marcus Evans remained unbroken. The boy with nothing but a photograph, a notebook, and a mind sharper than blades, was not waiting for rescue. He was building the strength to rescue himself, and perhaps unknowingly, the strength to alter the fate of men who sat sipping wine under chandeliers, unaware of the storm rising from the streets below. Crystal chandeliers swayed faintly, as the storm outside rattled the windows of the crescent moon, an opulent sanctuary where laughter flowed as freely as the wine. Waiters glided between polished tables, silver trays reflecting golden light, while the city's most powerful gathered behind velvet curtains, savoring an evening designed to display wealth untouchable by rain. Nathan Caldwell, billionaire pharmaceutical tycoon, leaned back in a leather chair at the head of a long mahogany table, listening half-heartedly to board members who toasted to murders and whispered about rivals. His phone still buzzed with messages from lawyers handling a hostile takeover, but he forced his focus toward the crystal goblet, now filled with vintage wine, amber liquid glowing as though lit from within. The storm's rumble underscored the moment like percussion. He lifted the glass slowly, unaware of the danger trembling inside. The doors crashed open. A gust of icy air swept through, scattering candle flames. Marcus Evans, soaked through to his skin, stood framed in the entrance. His sneakers squeaked against the marble as he charged forward, voice erupting above the string quartet. Stop. It's poison. Conversations froze. Silverware clattered. Guests gasped. Security lunged from the shadows. To the wealthy, he looked like a trespasser, a street boy barging into a sacred hole of influence. But Marcus's eyes weren't wild. They were precise, alive with calculation. His gaze locked on Caldwell's glass, tracing not glamour but chemistry. The faint bitter scent invisible to others hit him with certainty, cyanide. The goblet slipped before lips touched it, shattering against the floor. Amber liquid splattered white marble, seeping like blood between tiles. Silence carved itself into the room. Marcus skidded to a halt, chest heaving, one arm raised defensively, the other gripping his battered notebook pressed tight against his ribs. Rainwater dripped from his hood, forming a small pool beneath his shoes, but his focus never wavered. He spoke again, voice steady this time, softer but edged with iron. "Don't drink, it's lethal." Security reached him, hands outstretched, but Caldwell raised his palm. Something about the boy's certainty pinned him to his seat. He studied Marcus with wary interest, noting the notebook swollen from storms, the ink-stained fingertips, the gaze sharper than any polished executive across the table. This was no random intrusion. This was a precision dressed in rags. Caldwell's instincts told him the kid believed every word. He let his men hover but not touch. "Explain," he ordered, tone clipped, commanding silence across the hall. Marcus swallowed, shifting his stance. The bitter scent still lingered, faint but undeniable to someone trained to recognize. He opened his notebook with trembling fingers, revealing hand-sketched diagrams of molecules, annotated equations squeezed between margins. He pointed toward the glass shards glinting under the chandeliers. "Potassium cyanide leaves a signature. Slight almond trace, almost imperceptible unless you've trained your nose. Heating can hide it, wine can mask it, but it's still there. Once it enters the bloodstream, cellular respiration halts. Death follows in minutes." His voice didn't shake, it rang with authority born not of status but survived. Gasps rippled through the room. The waiter who had served Caldwell shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward the exit. Marcus caught it instantly. "Him," he said, pointing with conviction. He handled the glass longer than required. He avoided eye contact. His wrist trembled. Guests turned in unison, eyes narrowing. The waiter's mask cracked, fear blooming across his face. For a moment the room felt like a courtroom. Marcus delivering testimony none could ignore. Caldwell leaned forward, studying both the boy and the suspect, his own pulse hammering against his cuffs. Security seized the waiter before he bolted. Caldwell's voice sliced through the chaos. "Hold him." The tycoon turned back to Marcus. "You're certain?" The boy met his, "I'd bet my life on it. I just did." Silence pressed heavily. Outside, thunder punctuated his words. In that instant, Marcus's intrusion became more than trespass. It was salvation, wrapped in science and desperation. Caldwell felt a flicker of recognition deep inside, a methodical sharpness that reminded him of someone long gone. He couldn't place it yet, but the resonance unsettled him. He rose, ignoring the whispers around him. "Bring the boy here," he commanded. Guards hesitated, unsure, but obeyed. Marcus was ushered forward, wet sneakers squealing across marble. He stood inches from a man whose empire spanned continents, their eyes locked across the wreckage of broken glass. The contrast was almost mythic, privilege in tailored silk, poverty in soaked cotton. Yet both tethered by the scent of poison. "Who are you?" Caldwell asked, voice low, probing. Marcus straightened. "Marcus Evans. My parents were scientists. They taught me to trust evidence." Tonight the evidence screamed before anyone listened. His words carried neither arrogance nor apology, only fact. Caldwell felt a chill run through him. The name clung to memory, tugging threads he couldn't yet unravel. He studied the boy longer, as though searching for ghosts behind those piercing eyes. Police sirens wailed closer, echoing against storm-soaked glass. Guests murmured in fear and outrage. Some demanded answers, others whispered about scandal. Yet Caldwell's focus never left Mark. "Why risk yourself bursting in here?" he asked finally. Marcus's reply came without hesitation. "Because knowledge is power. If I stayed silent, you'd be dead." The mantra resonated in the billionaire's chest, like an echo from another life. Officers stormed through the doors, corralling guests and questioning staff. The detained waiter struggled, shouting protests, but sweat betrayed him. Under interrogation, cracks formed quickly. Marcus watched, heart pounding but steady, notebook clutched like armor. He had exposed the crime before it claimed the victim, but he knew this was only the beginning. Powerful enemies didn't vanish with a single confession. He felt eyes on him, hostile, calculate. His gut told him the poison was merely a symptom of something larger, something that reached far beyond the restaurant table. Caldwell's gaze softened briefly. Against his own instincts, he felt compelled to shield this boy. There was steel in Marcus's posture, but beneath it exhaustion too heavy for his years. Something about his scientific precision, his refusal to hesitate, stirred Caldwell's conscience in ways boardrooms never had. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt the weight of responsibility not just for markets, but for a life standing right before him. As the waiter broke under questioning, admitting he had been hired by unseen hands, the room buzzed with disbelief. Caldwell turned to Marcus once more. "You've made enemies tonight," he said, almost warning. Marcus's lips pressed thin. "I already had them. At least now they're visible." His words carried courage far beyond his age, courage forged in alleyways and lightning slashed sky, illuminating their faces, one framed by wealth, the other by survival. In that frozen moment, a fragile bond began to form, woven not by choice but by necessity. Neither fully understood its weight yet, but both sensed it would change everything. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, truth had been spoken. And for the first time, Nathan Caldwell realized the stranger, who had saved his life, was not simply a boy shouting warning. He was a catalyst, a mirror held against a world of privilege, and perhaps the only one capable of unraveling a conspiracy deeper than poison in a glass. Have you ever trusted a gut feeling to save someone, even at great risk? The night of the explosion lived inside Marcus Evans like a scar carved beneath his skin, one no stone could ever wash away. He remembered the way the city glowed that evening, neon stretching across skyscrapers, headlights weaving through crowded intersections, the usual chaos of progress masking the quiet dread that seeped into his home. His father, James Evans, moved through their apartment like a man haunted, briefcase clutched tighter than usual, shoulders rigid. His mother, Dr. Laura Evans, tried to lighten the tension with gentle words, but her smile trembled as if she too felt the shadow pressing close. Marcus, then a bright 15-year-old brimming with ambition, sat at the kitchen table, finishing equations for an advanced chemistry course he had begged to take early. He had no idea that night would be the last time he would ever see them alive. The cold came hours later, shattering the fragile walls of his world. A blast had ripped through the laboratory where his parents worked. Flames roared against the skyline, smoke curling into the November air like a black flag of surrender. Officials claimed it was an accident, faulty equipment, a tragic malfunction. But Marcus remembered details too sharp to ignore. His father's warning days earlier, if anything happens, protect the notes. His mother's last whispered words before leaving, be careful who you trust. Neither of them ever came home. Their research vanished with the fire, and their deaths were stamped into reports as unfortunate collateral in the march of science. The funeral was small, hastily arranged. Few colleagues attended, their absence louder than any eulogy. Marcus clutched a framed photo, trying to process the hollow silence where once laughter and debate had filled rooms. He watched men in suits exchange glances, whispers curling like smoke around the graves. It was as if his parents had been erased, reduced to statistics, their groundbreaking work buried deeper than their bodies. He vowed silently then, he would not let the truth be buried with them. At first he believed his brilliance would carry him forward despite grief. His teachers praised his intellect. His name appeared on lists for scholarships, his application to MIT already whispered as a certainty. But grief has a way of unspooling life thread by thread. The foster system swallowed him when relatives refused responsibility. Shelter walls pressed in with rules that stifled him. Voices that called him trouble when all he carried was a notebook and relentless questions. Nights became battles against sorrow, hunger, and a system that saw him not as potential but as a burden. The slide was gradual. 1 month, he still attended advanced classes, the next he was too distracted by court dates and caseworkers to focus. Soon, he missed exams. The entire day vanished in waiting rooms. Eventually the world labeled him not as a prodigy but as a drop. The fall felt like betrayal by institutions, by family, by justice. One moment, he was an honor student, the next he was sleeping beneath overpasses, clutching a notebook instead of a backpack, chasing shadows of answers in discarded textbooks salvaged from dumpsters. Yet amid ruin, his mind refused to die. Grief became fuel, anger became discipline. Every night beneath the roar of traffic, he opened his notebook and filled it with diagrams, theories, chemical breakdowns scavenged from memory and observation. He tested water with strips traded for tutoring, recorded results like a scientist conducting fieldwork, even if his lab was a milk crate and his equipment stitched from trash. He read library books until guards chased him out at close. He hovered near university dumpsters, scavenging fragments of experiments too small for professors but invaluable to him. Slowly, he rebuilt his education brick by brick, self-taught resilience, shaping him sharper than any classroom. Marcus knew the explosion was no accident. He pieced together inconsistencies from old articles, vague statements that failed to align, and suspicious silences from former colleagues. He remembered overhearing fragments of conversations, his father worried about data falsification, his mother whispering about corruption tied to funding. The clues burned like coals, never cooling. He suspected sabotage but with no proof, he could only carry questions, each one heavier than hunger. His pursuit of answers became an obsession, but also a salvation. It gave him purpose when everything else was stripped away. The city itself became both enemy and teacher. Rain soaked him nightly, yet it also provided cover for experiments. Neon lights marked him with promises of wealth he could never touch, but they reminded him of energy, of chemistry and motion. Police sirens reminded him that survival required strategy. Every hardship became a lesson in adaptation. While others saw a homeless boy, Marcus saw himself as a researcher in exile, collecting data from the cracks of society, forging brilliance from despair. Sometimes he imagined his parents watching, urging him forward. He remembered his father's hands guiding him through his first chemical reaction, his mother's laughter when he mispronounced compounds, but explained them better than textbooks. Those memories were painful, but they kept him alive. He carried their photo everywhere, edges worn smooth, colors blurred by storms, but eyes clear as truth. They anchored him when hunger hollowed his stomach or hopelessness tried to drag him under. Years of survival honed his instincts sharper than any classroom test. He learned to read people as easily as chemical reactions, the way a hand twitched when lying, the way eyes darted when hiding guilt. He developed senses attuned not only to danger, but to detail. The faintest odor, the subtlest shift in behavior, became data points logged in his genius was not just in molecules, but in patterns, human and chemical alike. The tragedy shaped him, but it never defined him as a victim. Instead it carved him into something the privileged would never anticipate, a survivor whose brilliance thrived in shadow. While corporations toasted profits in glass towers, Marcus was in alleys testing water for children too poor to buy bottled. While universities debated ethics in lecture halls, Marcus wrestled with real consequences, using science not as theory, but as a His brilliance did not shine in polished labs, it flickered in rain, fueled by grief, sharpened by loss. At times he wondered if justice would ever come. Was anyone even searching for the truth of the explosion, or had the world moved on, erasing his parents as easily as erasing him from classrooms? Those questions haunted him, but they also kept him awake, scribbling late into the night, recording ideas he swore one day would expose lies too powerful to remain hidden. The boy who once dreamed of Nobel Prizes, now dreamed of survival and truth. Yet even in darkness, ambition burned. He still imagined standing in lecture halls, not as a student, but as a force, presenting discoveries that could not be ignored. He imagined confronting those who dismissed his family, holding evidence so clear even corruption could not bury it. He imagined justice, not just for himself, but for every overlooked voice in shadows. In the end, Marcus's tragedy forged not weakness but resilience. It stripped away privilege, comfort and recognition, leaving behind only determination and brilliance sharpened by pain. The explosion that stole his parents created a wound that never healed, but within that wound, strength grew. He was no longer simply a boy abandoned by system. He was a survivor, a scientist, a seeker of truths too dangerous for the powerful to acknowledge. And though the city saw only another destitute teenager fading into rain, Marcus Evans carried inside him the fire of two lost scientists, the discipline of self-taught mastery, and a relentless vow, he would uncover the truth, no matter how deep it had been. Think of someone whose brilliance was ignored. Could you give them a chance to shine? The restaurant still trembled from the shock of Marcus's intervention. Guests whispered in anxious clusters, their voices ricocheting against chandeliers, as stone-light flashed across the glass walls. Nathan Caldwell remained seated at the head of the long table, though his composure was more forced than real, his mind reeling from what had just unfolded. In front of him shards of the shattered goblet glittered like frozen lightning, the spilled wine spreading in jagged rivulets that stained the marble floor crimson. The storm outside pounded harder, each crack of thunder amplifying the tension inside. Marcus stood at the center of it all, drenched, thin, but unwavering. His notebook, battered and patched with tape, looked almost absurd against the grandeur of the crescent moon, yet it commanded more authority than the golden chandeliers overhead. He flipped it open, pages warped from rain yet alive with diagrams drawn in hurried but precise strokes. Molecules, reaction chains, notes scrawled in margins, his world written into fragile paper. He lifted the notebook for Caldwell and the gathering crowd to see. Potassium cyanide, Marcus began, his voice carrying through the hushed hall. He tapped a diagram of hexagonal bonds, arrows, indicating disruption of oxygen pathways. It binds to cytochrome oxidase in cells, preventing respiration. It suffocates from within, invisible, silent. The scent you might catch faintly almond, is the only warning. One sip from that glass, and within minutes your body would collapse. His words were measured, calm, as though he were presenting in a classroom instead of standing trial before the elite. The guests murmured, some horrified, others skeptical, but all unable to dismiss the certainty burning in his tone. Marcus didn't falter. He bent closer to the glass fragments on the floor, his sharp eyes reading details invisible to others. The liquid clung to the rim differently than it should. It was handled twice. That's why I ran in when I did. He turned abruptly, pointing at the waiter restrained by guards. He lingered when pouring. His wrist trembled. His eyes avoided yours. He slipped it in. The waiter's face blanched, sweat pooling at his brow despite the cold draft from the storm. He stammered, but Marcus's words had already drawn suspicion thick as smoke. Caldwell studied the boy, unsettled. There was something disturbingly familiar in the precision of his explanation. In the way he distilled complexity into clarity, as if he had inherited the cadence of someone Caldwell once knew. He couldn't place it yet, but his instincts told him the resemblance was no coincidence. The police arrived, their heavy boots pounding against marble as they fanned through the restaurant. Officers took statements, secured evidence, and pressed the waiter against the wall. The man's protests began sharply but quickly crumbled under pressure. His voice cracked, his story shifted, and soon his confession spilled out like the storm outside. Yes, he had been hired. Yes, the target was Caldwell. No, it wasn't personal, just business. He had been promised money to slip cyanide into the drink, money to vanish once the deed was. By who? Demanded an officer. The waiter's eyes darted, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried across the room. Richard Baxter. The name cut through the air like lightning. Caldwell's face darkened, jaw tightening. Baxter, his fiercest rival in the pharmaceutical industry, was known for ruthless tactics, but attempted murder escalated the rivalry into something far deadlier. Guests exchanged shocked glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Marcus absorbed the revelation silently, his suspicion confirmed. Corruption ran deeper than whispers, and men at the top would kill to protect their empires. Caldwell exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the board. Marcus had not only saved his life, but also unveiled a conspiracy before it could sink back into the shadows. His mind, already sharp from years of boardroom battles, recognized something extraordinary in the teenager. The boy's methods, his reasoning, his refusal to waver in a room filled with hostility, all of it felt eerily reminiscent of someone Caldwell had once admired. He studied Marcus longer, knees giving way to intrigue. The officers dragged the waiter out, his protests fading beneath the storm's roar. The restaurant remained tense, guests shaken and restless, but Caldwell's focus narrowed to the boy standing opposite him. You should not have been here, Caldwell said finally, his voice low, controlled. And yet without you, I'd be dead. His eyes flicked to the notebook, then back to Marcus's face. Where did you learn all this? Marcus hesitated, droplets sliding from his hair onto the marble. He clutched the notebook tighter. I learned because I had no choice. The streets don't forgive ignorance, and my parents. His voice caught, but he steadied it with visible effort. They taught me science is more than equations, it's survival. Caldwell's breath caught. That phrasing, that conviction, it echoed ghosts he had buried. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the polished table. He didn't yet dare voice the thought clawing at him. But the suspicion rooted deeper with every word. Marcus spoke. The storm outside wailed, rattling windows, rain streaking down in endless sheets. Inside, Marcus's presence seemed to grow, not from wealth or status, but from the undeniable brilliance radiating through his every word. Guests who had first dismissed him as a trespasser, now watched him with wary respect. Some leaned in closer, others stepped back as though overwhelmed by the weight of what he represented. Marcus's eyes moved across the room, meeting gazes that had always looked past boys like him. You sit behind chandeliers, and think danger cannot touch you, he said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. But tonight proved even privilege can be poisoned. Science doesn't care about power, truth doesn't care about wealth. It just exists, and it screams when ignored. The room quieted, no one daring to interrupt. Caldwell found himself shaken not just by the poison, but by the courage standing before him. Marcus had walked into danger with nothing but a notebook and conviction, and in doing so, had exposed rot at the highest level. Caldwell wondered if he was witnessing, not merely survival, but the beginning of something larger, something he himself could not yet define. The police departed, leaving order restored but questions unresolved. Baxter's name lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Caldwell knew the battle with his rival had escalated into war, but for the first time, he sensed he was not fighting it alone. He turned once more to Marcus, curiosity laced with something deeper, almost protective. You realize what you've done tonight, don't you? Marcus nodded faintly, exhaustion shadowing his features, but resolve burning undimmed. I stopped one attempt, but there will be more. Men like Baxter don't stop until someone forces them. His words carried not fear but certainty, forged in hardship. Caldwell felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, respect, perhaps even admiration. He could not deny it. Genius stood before him, disguised in rags, armed only with intellect. The storm rolled on, but inside, silence carried more weight than thunder. The boy and the billionaire regarded one another across shattered glass and spilled wine, bound now by survival and secrets too dangerous to ignore. When did you last see genius in an unexpected phase? Rainhammer for Sirius is determined to wash secrets into the gutters, yet inside Nathan Caldwell's brother they study at the crescent moon. The storm only magnified what could no longer be contained. The guests had gone, the police had left, and silence pressed heavily over the mahogany walls. A fire crackled faintly in the hearth, but its warmth did little to cut through the chill that hung in the air. Marcus Evans stood across from Nathan, water dripping from his soaked hoodie onto the antique rug, his battered notebook clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Nathan's gaze fixed on the boy with unsettling intensity. For hours, questions had spun in his mind, tugging threads he had long buried. The precision in Marcus's explanations, the cadence of his reasoning, the unshakable certainty, it all stirred memories of a man he once knew well, a man whose absence still haunted him. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "That name you gave earlier, Evans, who were your parents?" Marcus hesitated, his throat tight. He had kept this truth locked away for years, guarded like treasure and curse alike, but tonight, after poison in a goblet and a rival's name exposed, hiding no longer felt possible. He lifted his chin, eyes unwavering. "Dr. James Evans was my father. Laura Evans is my mother." The words struck Nathan like a physical blow. He gripped the arm of his chair, breath images flooded back, James hunched over lab benches late into the night, his laughter filling sterile halls, his relentless pursuit of integrity when others bent to pressure. They had been partners, co-founders of projects meant to heal millions, and then, an explosion. A tragedy ruled an accident, a file closed too quickly. Nathan's chest constricted. James Evans was my colleague, my friend. His voice cracked under the weight he rarely allowed himself to feel. Marcus's voice steadied, though grief rippled beneath. He was more than that. He was a father who never compromised the truth, and he died for it. He opened his notebook, flipping to sketches copied from memory, fragments of formulas his father once explained over dinner. He pointed at them with trembling fingers. He discovered falsified trial data. He told me he couldn't stay quiet. He knew exposure would put him in danger. Marcus's eyes burned as he met Nathan's. The explosion wasn't an accident, it was murder. Lightning split the sky outside, thunder shaking glass pane. Nathan staggered back, guilt slicing deeper with every word. He had suspected foul play years ago, but buried his doubts under mountains of responsibilities and distractions. Yet hearing it spoken by James's son ripped open wounds he thought healed. His voice dropped to a whisper, "And I did nothing." Marcus's anger flared, but it was controlled, tempered by years of survival. "You built an empire on research you began with him. Did you ever ask why his work disappeared, or why my mother's notes vanished into drawers that never reopened?" His voice cracked for the first time, grief spilling through the cracks. "You had the power to fight. I had nothing but a notebook." Nathan's throat constricted. "Laura, your mother," he faltered, shame rising. "For years I've been funding her care in a private facility after the accident. She survived the blast but suffered neurological damage. I thought I was honoring James by protecting her. I didn't know." His eyes widened as realization crashed down. "I didn't know you were out here alone." Marcus froze, shock rippling through him. His chest tightened as if the storm had punched through the walls. "You've been funding her care." His voice was almost too soft to hear. Memories flooded back. The officials who told him both parents were gone, the nights he cried into silence, the years of believing no one remained. His hands shook as anger and relief collided. "All this time she was alive. And you never looked for me." Nathan's heart pounded. Shame dug its claws into him. I thought you had been placed in the system. Cared for. I trusted officials when they said nothing more could be done. I buried myself in work, in protecting her. Convincing myself it was enough." His voice broke. "I failed you, Marcus. I failed James." The storm intensified, rain slamming glass like fists. Marcus's face hardened, a mask of resilience built through years of abandonment. "You did fail. I lived in alleys while you sat in towers. I searched dumpsters while you signed contracts. My father's blood is on Baxter's hands, but your silence gave him cover." The name hit like venom. Richard Baxter. Nathan clenched his fists, fury boiling. "Baxter falsified those data reports. James told me once he was worried, but I dismissed it as paranoia. And then James was gone. I see it now." He turned toward Marcus, voice raw with conviction. "Baxter murdered your father, and if he knows you survived with knowledge of what James discovered, then you're his next target." Marcus absorbed the words, his body trembling not from fear, but from the enormity of truth, finally spoken. For years he had chased shadows. Tonight the shadows finally had names. His grief solidified into resolve. "Then let him cut." "I've been surviving his world since the night flames took everything. But now I'm not running." Nathan stared at him. The boy's defiance stirring something inside him that he thought long dead, the courage to fight not just for profit, but for justice. He saw James's fire in Marcus, Laura's brilliance in his eyes, and his own guilt mirrored back at him. The teenager was no longer just a savior of his life, he was the living embodiment of conscience. Nathan had lost. Thunder rolled again, louder than before, as though the city itself bore witness to their confrontation. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. Grief colliding with rage, truth unmasking power, futures rewritten in the span of breaths. Nathan moved closer, his voice firm now. "We expose Baxter, together. We take the evidence, what your father left behind, what you've recorded, and we bring him down. Marcus clutched the notebook tighter, its damp pages carrying the weight of years. He had lived for this moment, for someone with power to finally stand beside him. Yet trust did not come easily. Words won't bring my father back, he said quietly. But action might bring justice. The two locked eyes, an unspoken pact forged between storm and silence. Neither knew if they would survive the war ahead, but both understood retreat was no longer an option. Outside, the city drowned in rain, sirens weaving through streets like hunting dogs. Somewhere across that storm, Richard Baxter sat in an office built on deception, unaware that the boy he thought erased was alive and ready to fight. Marcus turned toward the window, rain cascading down the glass like tears. His reflection stared back, not just a destitute teenager, but the son of a murdered scientist, the heir to truth too dangerous to bury. The storm didn't frighten him anymore, it mirrored him, relentless, unyielding, ready to strike. Have you ever uncovered a truth that changed how you saw someone's? 6 months later, the storm felt gentler, as if the sky had learned to breathe again. A fine mist threaded the air over MIT's great dome, softening in edges and turning puddles across Killian Core into silver mirrors. Students flowed beneath umbrellas toward the infinite corridor, laughter mixing with the rustle of wet leaves. Marcus Evans walked among them, in a lab coat that once belonged to his father. The curtain had been cleaned, stitched and pressed, yet a tiny coffee stain near the cuff remained, an ordinary blemish that steadied him more than any honor. He had crossed from overpass shadows to lecture halls, from scavenged glassware to instruments calibrated to the third decimal, and the rain that once felt like an enemy now arrived like a companion bearing news. Acceptance had appeared as a quiet email that changed everything. Scholarships assembled swiftly after that, some endowed by alumni, others anonymous. He moved into a dorm room that smelled of detergent and dry erase ink, pinned his parents' photo above the desk, and placed his battered notebook beside a brand new. Between lectures he met with Nathan Courtwell to finalize a plan neither of them could abandon once spoken aloud. Remorse had driven Nathan to open doors, conviction kept them open. What began as a promise became the Evans Caldwell Foundation, housed in a modest building near Kendall Square. Its mission was precise: complete James Evans's cancer treatment with transparent methods and uncompromising integrity, and deliver access to families who had waited too long. Nathan transferred patents, opened archives, and surrendered control clauses that once would have been sacrosanct. Audit teams reviewed every script, spreadsheet and endpoint. Marcus insisted the clinical pipeline include price caps, data sharing, and a community board with real authority. He had lived the cost of secrecy, he would not reproduce. Inside the lab that now carried his parents' names, work advanced in measured steps. Graduate students cultured cells, purified proteins and checked controls twice before touching datasets. Whiteboards showed pathways explaining how the therapy retrained a receptor to stop feeding tumor growth while sparing healthy tissue. A framed page of James's handwriting hung above a bench like a light. Across from it, Laura's notes on consent reminded the team that progress without respect is simply speed. Regulatory approvals arrived in careful stages, each one earned, each one celebrated with tea instead of champagne. Meanwhile, distant thunder moved closer over Richard Baxter's empire. Federal agents served warrants at his headquarters and at a suburban facility where a basement held servers labeled with false project names. Prosecutors unsealed indictments for conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction and witness tampering. The waiter from the Crescent Moon testified, followed by analysts who traced shell companies used to launder consulting fees into silence. A former statistician produced emails demanding that adverse events be recorded as unrelated. Investors fled, directors resigned, a courtroom calendar filled with dates that once belonged to product launches. The therapy's impact arrived first as graphs, then as people. A teacher from Detroit wrote that her scans finally showed shrinkage without the metallic taste that had stolen breakfast. A carpenter in Austin sent a photograph from a school auditorium where his daughter played violin under paper stars. In Boston, a nurse stepped into a hallway to steady herself after biomarkers fell below every projection. Marcus printed each note and taped it to a wall. The team called the map of rain, because the messages gathered like droplets, separate until seen together as weather. The memorial ceremony came on a Thursday when the drizzle felt like a blessing. Families, faculty, students and staff filled a hall whose glass reflected slick walkways and lilac umbrellas clustered like petals. A black veil hid a brass plaque near the podium. Programs listed scholarships for first-generation scientists, childcare funds for researchers with families, and the launch of mobile lab vans that would visit shelters to test water, teach fundamentals and demystify diagnostics. Donors' names filled the page, yet the central lines honored two scientists who had refused to trade accuracy for applause. Nathan stood near the aisle, rain beading on his overcoat. He looked thinner, grief-worn, honestly on his face instead of tucked behind calendar. When he saw Marcus, he straightened his tie and stepped forward. "Your mother would tell you not to ruin that coat on a day like this," he said softly, a tentative invitation toward normal. Marcus touched the cuff, then answered, "She never won that argument," and added after a breath, "Thank you for guarding her when the world forgot me." Nathan lowered his eyes. "I should have looked harder," he said. "I cannot replace what you lost, but I can help build what you know." Marcus nodded once, not a pardon, not a sentence, simply truth acknowledged. The dean opened with a reminder that science is a covenant. An oncologist presented interim results plainly, because truth does not require flooring. A nurse read a letter from a grandmother who could taste oranges again. Applause rose and faded in waves, never theatrical. Outside the mist thinned and the shy son glanced along the steps. When Marcus reached the podium, the room quieted to a single breath. He unfolded prepared remarks, then folded them again. "My parents believed knowledge should move toward the people who need it most," he said. "Precision without compassion is vanity, and compassion without precision is harm. Today we honor the promise they lived, and the patients who lend us hours we must not waste." He thanked technicians by name, saluted the statisticians who refused convenient errors, and credited a maintenance team that kept the building warm for night work. He did not mention his childhood under bridges, yet those years spoke through every choice. He stepped down to the plaque. Nathan joined him, fingers steady as they lifted the veil together. Letters caught the light. James and Laura Evans' Laboratory for Ethical Oncology. For a moment the hall sounded like rain on rooftops. Applause, small, steady, everywhere. Marcus closed his eyes and heard his father again. "Knowledge is power," spoken not as swagger but as duty. Afterward, he walked the infinite corridor, shoes whispering across stone worn smooth by generation. Bulletin boards bloomed with lectures and tutoring schedules. Through a window, he saw a seminar challenging bias with the patience of crafts. A poster announced the first Evans Caldwell Scholars, 10 students who had experienced homelessness, and would receive stipends, housing and mentors who listened. He recognized the guarded hope in their photographs. He had carried that expression across winters. At dusk he returned to the lab. Lamps along the paths glowed like careful constellations. He imagined the mobile vans unfolding microscopes beside shelter cots, a teenager watching cells divide for the first time, realizing that curiosity can be a bridge out of the night. He pictured library basements repurposed as test sites, rural clinics, with signal enough for teleconsults, and the world inching away from fear toward understanding. The rain softened to a hush that felt like pages turning. His phone buzzed, another clean scan, from the teacher in Detroit. "Thank you for giving me June." Marcus smiled without triumph and replied, "Keep going, we're with you." He set the phone aside and reached for a pipette, the familiar weight fitting his palm like an old truth. The work ahead would be slow, contested and often unglamorous. He had learned patience beneath freeways. He could spare patience for healing. Night gathered, and the dome shone like a quiet moon above wet lawns. Marcus hung his father's coat on a hook, pressed his hand against the fabric, then pulled on a fresh one embroidered with his own name. He checked the incubator, logged temperatures, and initialed a form for the next delivery of reagents. In the window, his reflection overlapped with glassware, and campus lights, and the weather that had followed him since childhood. For once the rain did not sound like a warning. The night felt newly possible. It sounded like applause carried across stone, welcoming a promise kept. Morning light spilled across the city like gold poured through glass, touching rooftops, bridges, and sidewalks that once reflected only storm water. Where thunder had once echoed as a warning, birds now threaded songs through branches rising clean against the skyline. 6 months earlier, the streets had carried fear. Now they carried possibility. The Evans Caldwell Foundation had become more than a name etched on a plaque. It had become a current, pushing ripples outward, until entire communities felt the pull. The first evidence arrived in hospital wings. Patients who once watched calendars shrink into nothing, now held them open, marking anniversaries they never expected to see. A grandmother in Houston walked unassisted into her kitchen and peeled an orange for the first time since chemotherapy stripped her taste away. In Chicago, a college student who had hidden her diagnosis returned to class with her hair regrown, standing at the board to solve equations without trembling. Letters arrived daily at the foundation. Thank you written in block capitals, drawings from children whose parents were recovering, photographs of reunions in parks and backyards. Staff taped them across a wide hallway, and visitors slowed each time, reminded that science was not abstract, but breathing in every smile on the wall. The impact stretched further than hospitals. Scholarships bearing James and Laura Evans' names reached youth living in shelters and foster care. Applications poured in, not just with transcripts, but with stories written late at night under dim lamps. One teenager in Seattle described fixing broken radios to understand circuits because textbooks were locked behind paywall. Another in Atlanta explained sneaking into libraries after closing to read medical journals discarded in recycling bins. The foundation offered not only tuition, but safe housing, mentors and stipends that covered food, so no one had to choose between knowledge and hunger. Marcus met each cohort personally, shaking hands, offering notebooks and reminding them that brilliance does not vanish because society overlooks it. When he stood before them, he saw his own reflection, restless, hungry, capable of reshaping future. Mobile labs soon followed, vans painted with rain motifs, each equipped with centrifuges, microscopes, laptops and fold-out benches. They rolled into neighborhoods where hospitals had closed, where children drank from taps without knowing what swam within. Scientists partnered with local volunteers, teaching students how to test water, explaining bacteria and metals in terms anyone could grasp. In New Mexico, a girl dipped a strip into a glass and watched it turn vivid pink, realizing for the first time that science was not a subject, but a tool for survival. In Detroit, a boy examined his own saliva under a microscope and gasped, laughing as he recognized living cells that were his, suddenly aware that biology lived inside him. Teachers reported attendance rising in classes, not because grades demanded it, but because curiosity had been. The ripple reached the legislature next. Whistleblower protections, long weakened by lobbying, found new strength in the wake of Baxter's fall. Lawmakers could no longer ignore testimony when Marcus stood before committees, explaining with calm precision how silence had killed his father, how data had been erased, how corporate interests had twisted truth. His story, amplified by survivors of the therapy, turned into a movement. Petitions gathered signatures by the hundreds of thousands, demanding safeguards for researchers who spoke out. Within months, bills were passed requiring independent audits of pharmaceutical trials, protections against retaliation, and funding for anonymous reporting channels. Headlines once dominated by scandal now carry phrases like systemic reform and accountability. The city itself transformed. Streets where rain once pooled like despair now glittered under murals, painted by youth funded through the foundation. Images of microscopes entwined with vines, of hands holding flasks and hearts alike, stretched across brick walls near subways. Cafes displayed jars where patrons donated spare change toward mobile labs. Concerts raised money for scholarship. Even corporations, wary after Baxter's downfall, began pledging transparency initiatives, racing not to conceal but to reveal. The atmosphere carried energy, not naive optimism, but hard-earned faith that change could spread like rain across stone, until even cracks bloomed. Marcus rarely sought attention, yet his presence became symbolic. When he walked MIT's corridors, freshmen whispered not about myth, but about reality. A peer who once slept beneath overpasses now designed experiments, shaping global policy. He continued his studies, often working late, coat sleeves rolled, eyes scanning data while his phone buzzed with updates from patients and lawmakers alike. In interviews he deflected praise, redirecting focus to those still overlooked. The next breakthrough may come from a child fixing a broken toy in Lagos, or a girl coding by candlelight in Mumbai, he told one journalist. Our job is to make sure they are seen. Nathan Caldwell watched this transformation with a mix of pride and humility. Once defined by wealth and rivalries, he now found meaning in repair. He spent hours in the foundation's offices rather than boardrooms, listening to families, signing checks not to enlarge profits, but to fund outreach. The fall of Baxter's empire had stripped illusions of invincibility from the industry. Regulators circled, shareholders demanded ethics reports, and companies scrambled to avoid becoming the next target of reform. Yet Nathan no longer feared scrutiny. For the first time in decades, he welcomed it, knowing that legacy was measured not in billions, but in lives. The global press told the story in chapters. One headline highlighted a refugee camp in Jordan, where mobile labs detected lead levels in water, prompting immediate intervention. Another described scholarships extended to rural students in Canada's north, where the internet once crawled more slowly than ambition. Documentaries showed before and after footage of hospitals, parents once gaunt now lifting children, communities celebrating not miracles but accessible science. Marcus became emblematic of resilience, yet he insisted on sharing credit with every technician, driver, mentor and student who carried the mission forward. The most poignant evidence of impact lay in whispers of children who no longer feared rain. In neighborhoods where storms once flooded basements and contaminated taps, children ran barefoot through puddles, laughing. Parents watched without dread, knowing the water had been tested, treated and secured. For Marcus each raindrop felt like closure. What once symbolized grief had become an emblem of renewal. The city no longer drowned under a downpour, it flourished under it. On an April evening, the foundation hosted a global summit broadcast from Boston. Representatives from Africa, Asia, Europe and the Americas gathered to share results, strategies, and challenges. Marcus stood on stage, modest yet steady, delivering updates with clarity. Behind him a screen displayed not graphs but faces. Survivors, students, families, community. He spoke of resilience as a resource, of science as a service, of justice as a foundation. Every drop counts, he concluded, echoing the rain motif. Every unseen voice matters, every life deserves the truth. Applause erupted, not staged, but real. Waves crashing from across the world, echoing the thunder of storms past yet reshaped into music. As the summit closed, Marcus stepped outside. Rain had returned lightly, brushing his hair, sliding across glass towers that glowed like lanterns. The city shimmered vibrant, alive, no longer a place of despair, but of resilience shared. He tilted his head back, letting drops fall across his face, no longer bracing against them, but welcoming them as reminders of survival and promise. Behind him the Foundation's banner rippled in the wind, bold letters reflecting streetlights. Knowledge is power. He thought of his father's mantra, of his mother's smile, of the alley where he once tested water with salvaged strips. He thought of patients writing letters, students opening scholarships, and whistleblowers unafraid to speak. Each thread had woven into something larger than himself. He had uncovered truth, endured storms, and turned pain into momentum. Now the world carried it forward. The night settled over the city with a softness that felt earned. The streetlights glowed like warm embers along wet pavement, reflecting faces that once turned away but now leaned toward possibility. Marcus Evans stood outside the Evans Caldwell Foundation, after another day inside labs alive with discovery. His coat clung to his shoulders, its fabric carrying both legacy and new beginnings. He paused, letting raindrops land on his skin. To him, storms no longer symbolized loss, they marked transformation. Every ripple in every puddle echoed a truth. Change had begun, not with empires, not with governments, but with one voice refusing silence. The world had shifted in ways both monumental and quiet. Families in distant cities lived longer because of treatments once buried by greed. Young people once dismissed as statistics are now studied in classrooms, supported by scholarships that carry names once erased. Mobile labs unfolded on dusty roads and narrow alleys, teaching children to see science not as a privilege, but as a language accessible to all. Whistleblowers in boardrooms, laboratories, and government offices now spoke with strength, shielded by new protections carved from tragedy. Yet beneath these headlines and milestones, the greatest impact was less visible, a collective recognition that genius often hides where few bother to look. Marcus leaned against a stone pillar, watching students pass, watching families stroll beneath umbrellas. His journey had proven that brilliance can survive alleys, that integrity can outlast corruption, that courage can ignite reform powerful enough to topple dynasties. Yet he knew his story was not the only one. Somewhere tonight, another teenager scribbled diagrams under a flickering street lamp. Another child repaired broken electronics to understand the invisible. Another voice rehearsed truths the world was not ready to hear. Their struggles would not make the news, unless someone chose to note. The call was not only for leaders, but also for institutions. It belonged to everyone. A teacher recognizing potential in the back row, a neighbor offering space to study, a community listening when a voice cracked from fear, yet carried truth. Each action, no matter how small, was a torch passed forward. Marcus had carried his alone through storms, but he dreamed of a world where no one walked in darkness without another flame beside them. Inside the Foundation's hall, a wall of letters from patients and students grew heavier each day, paper curling from tape, ink smudged by tears of gratitude. Marcus often stopped to read them before leaving. Tonight was no different. He ran his fingers over one written in careful pencil by a boy in shelter housing. You showed me science is not just for rich kids. You showed me I matter. That sentence carried more weight than any accolade. It reminded him that hope was contagious if not. Nathan Caldwell joined him quietly, umbrella in hand. The billionaire who once measured life in profits, now measured it in progress, standing not above but beside. He looked at the boy who had saved his life and said softly, "Your fight lit a fire in all of. The question is, who else will carry it?" Marcus met his eyes and answered, "Everyone can, they just need to see themselves in the story." That story now belongs to the world, and this is where the audience enters. Because Marcus's journey is not a distant fable, it is a mirror. It asks every listener to pause, to look around their own streets, schools and cities, and to ask a question too powerful to ignore. Who's the Marcus in your world, waiting to change everything? Is it the quiet classmate sketching formulas no one understands? The neighbor who tinkers with machines until they hum again? The colleague raising concerns that others dismiss? The friend whose resilience masks brilliance? They are everywhere, hidden beneath the noise of daily life, and they are waiting for recognition, for trust, for someone willing to say, "I believe in you." Stories like Marcus's remind us that revolutions do not always begin with banners. Sometimes they begin with a whisper, a warning shouted in desperation, or a notebook clutched against rain. Sometimes they begin with a teenager society calls destitute, but destiny calls essential. And when we notice, when we amplify, when we choose to protect rather than dismiss, we create ripples strong enough to bend history. That is why this story must not end here. It must continue in every community, in every classroom, in every platform where voices rise. Sharing it is more than engagement. It is responsibility. By passing it forward, you may reach the next overlooked genius, the next whistleblower afraid to speak, the next survivor carrying answers in silence. So, let this be the call. Share their story. Let your circle know that hidden potential exists where few like this message, not as a gesture but as a promise that you see value in resilience. Subscribe to Hope Rising Stories, not for numbers but for the movement, because every new listener becomes another torchbearer. Change spreads when voices multiply, and you, listening now, are part of that chain. Whether in New York, London, Toronto, Sydney or beyond, your awareness matters. Your actions matter. Your willingness to look twice at the overlooked might uncover the Marcus who saves a life, who reforms a system, who turns storms into renew. Marcus lifted his face to the drizzle, eyes closing, a small smile breaking across features once hardened by hunger. He knew the work ahead was endless, but he no longer carried it alone. The world had begun to listen, the world had begun to act, and the world, he believed, would continue, if each person chose to ask the question and answer it with courage. So, one final time, let it echo through your thoughts, and into your streets. Who's the Marcus in your world, waiting to change everything? Share their story, like and subscribe to Hope Rising Stories, for more tales of courage. Because every voice matters, every truth deserves light, and every act of recognition may ignite the next revolution of hope.